Have you ever had this happen to you? That you have a time in your life, a moment in your life maybe even, where you discover something about yourself and your psychology, and then you look back and you see everything different. How does this happen? Doesn't it almost feel like it's sneaky? Like, how did your brain almost hide this from you before? Well, today I want to give you some examples of where this has happened to me and what I think is going on here, as well as some tips for how we can, as we go on in the future, maybe catch some of this sneaky stuff a bit earlier. Hey everyone, I'm Sonia, and on this channel I talk about relationships, I talk about attachment styles, and all of the healing and growth and hopefully eventual fulfillment that comes along with those. And one of the main things I like to do on this channel is to share examples. You know, when I talk about different attachment styles, I usually try to talk to someone with that attachment style to get their perspective. And the reason I do this is very related to what this video is about. This may be one of a series because it's a very big topic, but I really feel like it's only by going into these details and what things are really like that we can truly make those deeper connections and heal and grow and transform. So, to start with, just a few examples of my own, of times where I feel like I almost had the veil pulled from my eyes, and saw everything different, and it was almost hard to understand how I didn't see what was going on with my psychology beforehand. So one of them I've shared in a different video, the one I called Out of Sight, Out of Mind, about FAs and how, because I'm a healed, fearful avoidant, I had the tendency that can often happen where people who are not right in the FA's life in a more regular way can feel like they have sort of disappeared from their connection with them. And in that video, you know, the main point of that and how that happened was that I was seeing it in a completely different light. I felt like that was simply, I have a close connection with someone, I can pick it up anytime I want again. And so I wasn't seeing where the fearful avoidant tendencies were playing into that. And that is part of like how, as an attachment style, we need to understand what that is and why we're doing it. And then in terms of making changes, what's important to realize is if that's working for someone else who may not feel the same about it because they have a different attachment style. I've also had PTSD ever in my life. And that was an interesting case where I didn't realize that's what that was because, you know, I think we see a lot of movies or other ways in which that is portrayed. And it didn't look like that to me. You know, it felt more like my mind wandering back to some memories. And I didn't necessarily realize I was getting triggered. And so I didn't make that connection. I didn't make that connection for a while. That I think it came up, I'm trying to think of even how it came up. I think it came up secondarily in some other therapy I was doing. So it wasn't ever, you know, and then I did all this work, EMDR and all kinds of work, and it transformed my life. But here it had been this hidden PTSD this whole time. Here's a relationship-oriented one. Here's an example number 3. So I also feel like I didn't see the blind spots in my relationship and how I wasn't seeing my partner's perspective because I'm very empathic otherwise. And so it's kind of like knowing I was empathic and often do get things right with people and make guesses and assumptions, which also maybe has a little bit to do with that hypervigilance as an FA, right? But because of that, I felt I was sort of just expanding that to think that I was right in other cases. I wasn't seeing where that was starting to overlap into not realizing that other people are coming from a different worldview, right? We can be as empathic as we are. Still true that we have our own worldview and that there's going to be cases where we're not seeing things through the same lens as someone else. So now I think of those as 2 different things. A fourth one, and this is somewhat related to the PTSD as well, was I did not realize I was dissociated for a lot of my life, dissociated from my body a bit. And it was because I had decided that I just was fairly clumsy and didn't like sports and that kind of thing, right? And so I didn't realize that there was also this amount of dissociation that was going on. I'd experienced it for a long time, but I just had decided that's what it was due to. And so that's why I didn't realize. So with those specific examples in mind, let's look at like why this is happening. Why did it happen that I didn't realize in those cases? And why do we have a lot of times in our lives where we realize something and feel like we should have seen it earlier? So I'll say number 1 is that thing where we generalize. We generalize from experience when we hear about something, then we make sort of this mental concept about it, kind of like I said with the PTSD and what that's supposed to look like. So we gather the information. Our brain's always trying to do that. Like, it's how we have to filter out information, make sense of it in the world. So we'll make these mental constructs or models. But that may not look like, there may be a difference then in what that looks like in our actual life if we're experiencing it. So the mental model is helpful to a certain extent, but it can actually get in the way of our actually realizing and making that connection that this specific nuanced experience of our own that we're having is part of this thing that's this mental model. And that's particularly true if there's differences in it, right? If we've pulled in something like, having the way someone has a flashback looks, for example, in the case of PTSD, that it looks a certain way. If we've really pulled that specific in as part of the generalization, then we don't have it as part of our experience. That's going to make it extra likely that we don't recognize it. A second thing, and this one I think maybe we have to just accept, is that we're not always ready. We're not always at the place where we're going to do growth about a particular thing, or we're not always ready for that healing. So our defense mechanisms that do sometimes include suppression, in a way, were these beautiful coping techniques to get us through certain experiences. And so particularly for more difficult experiences, it can just be true that we need a particular time in our life when it's the right time to do the healing. Now, I think that this isn't as true perhaps for things that are less traumatic, though. Sometimes in those cases, it really is more just that it's a blind spot. I think there's truth, though, that there are times in our life when we have enough experience and maturity, or like we have enough support in our lives, perhaps, that we're able to work on particular things that are a bit more subtle and more difficult to get into with our own psychology, even if they're not traumatic. A third way that this can look, and this one does have a bit of a clue with it, in my opinion, is that, we have sort of this almost broader psychological defense mechanism that's not about our particular experience, but it's more about wanting to feel safe in the future. And this happens when people, for example, make up reasons why something bad happened to someone else. Right? They don't necessarily feel like they're making up the reasons. They feel like they're real reasons, but they try to say, oh, this person, well, they had this accident because this, that, and the other, like, for example. And, it can be really painful when we do this for the other person involved, but it also, it's really about trying to feel different from them so we don't feel scared about that happening to ourselves, right? And so this is one that's interesting because you might be able to catch it in yourself. Like, if something bad happens to someone, are you trying to say it happened for various reasons? And this can be a way in which then we miss something when it happens to ourselves too, because then in our mental model, we decide, oh, well, this kind of thing happens to people when they do this, that, and the other. Let's use an example of addiction. Maybe that's helpful. Maybe we have started to drink more and more, but we don't think of it as alcoholism or that it's heading that way, because in our mental model, we think people become alcoholics and we have this whole checklist of things that aren't even necessarily to do with the actual behavior, but are what we've associated with that in our minds. It can also be a way of, if we are having a particular circumstance, let's say, so I gave the example of a circumstance that was in the future that we didn't want to be scared of having. Maybe in the case, like I said, of that alcoholism, we secretly fear that we are alcoholic, and that makes us put up these barriers of, well, this person's different because this person's different because that. And if we were able to open more to that other person's experience, we might actually go the other way where we found similarities instead. But there's this defense mechanism of like, they're not like me, that's at play there. And that only goes, it's both less compassionate to the other person, but it also goes towards not recognizing things in ourselves and isn't helpful for us either. So what can we do about this? Like I said, on this channel, I try to be someone who helps with putting a lot of different experiences out there, talking about examples, and I think that can be really useful. So I think the top tip I would give is to try to, if you're exploring something, of course, you're sort of already on the growth path a bit there if you're exploring something, but trying to, when you're investigating something, when you're learning about attachment styles even, it's like really helpful to find out all the big concepts about it. But if you can try to like really hear people's lived experiences and examples, I think that goes a lot more of a way towards understanding yourself better. And then towards understanding what will work for you in the healing and all of it. And you could even take that as more of a general life stance. That's helpful just in terms of developing your empathy more too, trying to understand lots of people's different experiences are. It's really empathic towards them, but I really think that helps us too. It helps us understand our own experiences better and to see it in a fuller way. So what can we do, besides, because the first one I talked about there was that you're sort of already on a growth path step. So it's sort of how to investigate as you start to learn and change. And the second one was to have an empathic stance in your life in general. What can we do about the issues that are, just more sneaky and suppressed at any given time in our life? Well, here's a few clues that you could use that might help you to be onto some of your issues that are up for actual growth and processing at this time in your life. So one is to really notice what you're ruminating on. So what comes to mind a lot? Maybe a particular experience that you had just keeps popping into your mind a lot. I mean, that's really ripe for exploration. You want to go into that, like try to investigate. Don't just let it like cross your mind every so often here and there. Try to catch it and then take a little time and try to explore, like, what is it I feel about that situation? Try to explore, why is it coming to mind? You may need someone else though. Coaches and therapists can be really useful for this because we often just need someone else, even though it's going to be our wisdom that's coming out about it. Sometimes we just need another person to sort of help us draw it out of ourselves. And so they can be useful if you have a really good friend who's able to listen actively. So you want someone who is good at active listening here for whatever's coming up, that could be helpful. So whether it's your own exploration or if you're enlisting the help of someone else, see if you can explore just a topic that comes to mind and try to catch it, even if you just have no idea why it keeps coming to mind, but you notice that it's recurring. It just pops into your thoughts and you don't know why. Now, sometimes issues come up for resolving in us in a more sideways way. And so really trying to be open to that. It could be like that you have some behaviors that you're not happy about. And then so the step there would be that you're going to work on the behaviors, but being sort of ready that something else might come up and trying to catch that it might not only be about the behavior, that there may be like this root cause of the behavior, for example, or there could be something that's not like as directly connected, but that as you, particularly if it's a behavior that's helping you suppress your emotions, that then is able to sort of come to more consciousness because you're not suppressing more generally. So sort of being kind of ready for that if you're going to address a behavior and do behavior change, and also trying to catch it if it's something that feels less directly related. But hey, that's the time that it's coming up for processing. And so you can work on that as well as the behavior change or whatever is coming up that's more directly related to that. And I mentioned behavior change, but it could just be more that a certain area of your life's not going well too, right? So maybe it's, there's behaviors you're doing repetitively. It could be alcohol, it could be just that you watch shows over and over, or you can't stop scrolling on your phone, things like can be that kind of behavior. Maybe it's more just that you notice certain areas of your life just don't go well. Like you just can't, you always have work conflict, or you're never able to keep a goal that you set, whether it's about health or about something else that's a project of yours that you want to work on. Any of those things where something feels like it's not going right is going to be really a place for a lot of exploration, and just knowing going into it that there may be things that come up that do feel kind of like a surprise. And but that's a beautiful thing. It's actually allowing you this opportunity for growth and change and transformation. So what I'd like to leave you with is this understanding that you can go forward with in practical ways, that we all have different ideas in our minds about things. Sometimes that's in our own worldview and we're not seeing someone else's worldview is different. Sometimes that's because we have a conceptualization. We can't help having concepts about things in the world, and we don't recognize our own experience is fitting into that. Sometimes that can get us further away from understanding someone else and their own experience, and that might need attention from us, particularly if we know them well. And then often that person is really us. For all our ways that we're having our defense mechanisms or our concepts, we are really the ones who need some attention in a particular area.